director lead on the Global Early Adolescent Study. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our second webinar, exploring issues of empowerment. It is being led by Dr. Linnea Zimmerman. Linnea is an assistant professor here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health. She is the Director of Research Innovations at the GEAS, and her work focuses on adolescent empowerment, data quality, and research innovations and methodologies. She's also the Associate Director of Research for PMA 2020, where she oversees data management and analytic work for that project. Her interests intersect in reproductive health, humanitarian emergencies, and her dissertation focused on techniques of indirect estimation of mortality after and during humanitarian emergencies. She received her doctorate from the Bloomberg School of Public Health here at Hopkins, and an MPH degree from Emory University. So let me turn this over to you, Linnea, and we look forward to the webinar.
Thank you, Bob. During the webinar, Leah is actually going to be changing the slides for me. So just as people hear me say next slide, that's just for Leah to know. I will try to keep the presentation to about 40 minutes here and to allow 20 minutes for questions. And then Leah will also be facilitating that and moderating that session. And hopefully Bob and Caroline, who are the co-PIs for the Global Early Adolescent Study, can also jump in and answer questions if they relate to the overall study and provide some extra clarification. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. I'm just going to go briefly over the outline for the presentation. So we will start with just a very brief background of the Global Early Adolescent Study, or the GEAS study, for those of you who are not aware. And then we'll move to a brief background of empowerment measurement itself and why we felt that the current measurement agenda needed to be expanded and further explored to look at empowerment amongst adolescents aged 10 to 14. For the sake of time, the overview will be much shorter than it could be and probably deserves to be, given the complexity of measurement for empowerment, but we do only have 40 minutes. And then we'll go through the research questions, methodology, results, and have some time for discussion and conclusions before the end. Next slide. And really the next slide after that as well. Thank you. So the Global Early Adolescent Study it's a global study, and it focuses on understanding the factors in early adolescence that predict or predispose young people to subsequent sexual health risks, and conversely promote healthy sexuality. It focuses on urban poor in multiple countries, as you can see on the map. It really is a global project, and it's implemented by a network of research partners. Next slide. There is a specific focus in the Global Early Adolescent Study on understanding the development and consequences of gender norms. And so while this talk will focus on empowerment, it's important to keep in mind just that this discussion of empowerment is also framed within the larger discussion of gender norms and how norms lead to interactions between boys and girls and influence interactions, and how gender norms affect the ability of adolescents when they're forming their own beliefs about gender, how these beliefs align with social norms in their community and specific environment. So in this analysis, while we are looking at how to measure empowerment and more specifically agency amongst 10 to 14-year-olds, which we'll get into in a minute, we also just wanted to examine some of those results through a gender lens. And so we'll do that at the end. The original instruments that were developed through the Global Early Adolescence Study were developed through extensive formative and qualitative research, in addition to expert opinion and collaborator input. The instruments included questions about gender norms, gender equity and equality, and a much larger health instrument that included questions about health behaviors, experience of adverse events, questions about self-confidence and self-efficacy, and multiple other aspects of health, including empowerment, that we expect are related to later behaviors. So the instruments were piloted in 14 countries, and the data from this analysis comes from that original pilot. Next slide. So, of course, when we are discussing empowerment, we first have to actually define what empowerment is. There are a lot of different definitions, and so the next few slides will go through some of those and describe how, first of all, how empowerment is generally conceptualized in different frameworks, why we felt like those frameworks needed to be reevaluated or changed a little bit to see how empowerment by these definitions really applied or didn't to 10 to 14-year-olds. And I'll go through in more detail some of the frameworks that contributed the most to the GEAS conceptualization of empowerment, and why their specific strengths and weaknesses motivated the Global Early Adolescence Study to think in a slightly different way about how to measure this concept amongst 10 to 14-year-olds. And then I'll give the specific definition that the GEAS study used to guide this work. Next slide. As I'm sure most people, anyone who studies empowerment knows, there's no one definition of empowerment. And even less than having consensus on one definition of empowerment, there's also no consensus on how to measure it exactly. There are multiple frameworks that have been developed, and I listed only 2 here, but there are so many more. But these 2, the definition and framework developed by the World Bank, and the definition and framework recently developed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, are 2 frameworks that really try to define and conceptualize and give guidance on measurement of empowerment in a very broad sense. So oftentimes empowerment is measured or conceptualized for a very specific reason, so or how it relates to a very specific aspect of life. So it may be conceptualized as economic empowerment, or empowerment to make sexual and reproductive health decisions, empowerment to use contraception, etc. And so many of the frameworks that have been developed really focus on these kind of specific aspects and the domains of empowerment that go into achieving those specific goals, while the World Bank and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are a bit more broad in how they conceptualize empowerment. The commonality, however, there are commonalities in almost all of these frameworks. So the first commonality is that empowerment is really viewed as both a process and an outcome. So women and adolescents are continually going through the process of empowerment, and yet at the same time it is something that is also viewed as a final outcome, that empowerment itself is something that can be achieved. At the same time, empowerment is not binary. It's not as though you can be 49% empowered and then at 51% empowered, suddenly you are fully empowered. It is a gradual process. It is a lifetime process. It is also multidimensional. Being empowered in one aspect of your life does not necessarily mean you are empowered in all other aspects. So, for example, a woman may be very economically empowered within the household. She may be able to make decisions about how household finances are spent, but that doesn't mean that she has full empowerment outside of the household. Perhaps she may have very little legal standing outside of the home. And so there are many different aspects of empowerment, and each of those although they're tied together, they can also operate somewhat independently. And so, again, being empowered in one does not mean that you are empowered in all others. And finally, that it involves both external processes or structures. So these might be structural or resources, some going along the lines of the legal frameworks or political frameworks that exist, social and familial norms, and then that there's also internal aspects to empowerment, and those include things along the lines of self-efficacy or self-esteem. And we'll talk a little bit more about the concept of agency in a moment, which really guided our thoughts about empowerment and how we measure it in this paper and project. And then, but of course, since there are so many different definitions and frameworks, there are differences. The main difference in how these different frameworks conceptualize empowerment is their identification of the specific domains or dimensions. So for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation focuses on the concepts of voice, choice, and power, whereas the World Bank looks more at agency and opportunity structures or resources. So while they are conceptualizing the same thing, ultimately, how those domains are defined, how they intersect with each other, and how they're measured is different because these conceptual frameworks are different. And finally, as I mentioned before, there are differences in whether the frameworks are estimating a global definition of empowerment. And what I mean by global is not necessarily universal across all countries, but global in the sense of generalized empowerment versus specific definitions of empowerment, such as economic empowerment or sexual and reproductive health empowerment. So next slide. There were two frameworks that really guided the global early adolescence study in the original thinking about empowerment and how it applied to 10 to 14-year-olds. There's Andrew Malhotra's work at the World Bank, which I'll talk a bit more in a moment again about the ideas of agency and opportunity, or agency and resources. But within Malhotra's work, there were 4 dimensions of agency that are identified as important for the achievement of agency. And those are socio-cultural, which include the idea of the freedom of movement and the freedom to move around in space and the environment. Familial and interpersonal, so that included participation in domestic decision-making, participation in the home, etc. Psychological, which gets at the concepts of self-esteem and self-efficacy, as I noted before, and economic, which includes access to and control over personal as well as family resources. In the discussions, though, the frameworks around that radical feminism had developed around empowerment were also brought in, and how these concepts of empowerment may or may not be related to the development of empowerment for 10 to 14-year-olds. And those dimensions include questioning the status quo, questioning norms, the ability to voice opinions, which is something that is, again, somewhat universal to all frameworks, although it's conceptualized or named slightly differently. But the ability to voice opinions or voice thoughts, resisting coercion, and soliciting desired or preferred outcomes. So being able to actually achieve the outcomes that adolescents or individuals want. So next slide again. So these are very comprehensive definitions, generally comprehensive frameworks, but we did identify a few specific limitations. And the first is that many of the domains that are often conceptualized for empowerment may not be relevant for adolescents aged 10 to 14. So for example, adolescents cannot participate broadly in most legal and political spheres in anywhere in the world. Until they are adults, most adolescents are simply restrained by legal frameworks. And so their ability to participate or not may not be a very good reflection of full empowerment. And another example might be the oversight of domestic expenditures versus personal expenditures. So adolescents in some countries or contexts may have access to some personal economic resources that they can spend, but in most places they're unlikely to really have substantial contributions to the overall household decision-making process on how and when you spend money. So we did think that while these spheres are important to think about, and certainly those spheres influence the outside and external structures, they themselves may not be the most appropriate domains for adolescents. And they may not even be things that adolescents are really, at the age of 10 to 14, really conceptualizing or thinking about on the broader scale. And finally, there are the aspects of sort of sexual and reproductive health, although those are very important, particularly as adolescents age. At the age of 10 to 14, in most contexts, sexual behavior is still generally very infrequent. And so empowerment measures that were really specific to those domains or concepts were just not really one, easy to measure amongst this group, or necessarily very appropriate to use to define empowerment when it is a topic and an aspect of life that is really still in the future. So next slide. So with all that in mind, what is the definition of empowerment we're using? We're using essentially the World Bank definition, which is the process of enhancing an individual or group's capacity to make effective choices. That is, to make choices and then transform these choices into desired actions and outcomes. So the ability to conceptualize that you have a choice, that you can make that choice, and that you can actually turn that choice into reality. And within this definition, there's really two larger concepts. And the first is agency, which is an individual or a group's ability to make purposeful actions or purposeful choices and act on their values. And so in this case, we are really talking about the agency of a 10 to 14-year-old to make decisions that are relevant to their lives and act upon those decisions. And then implicit within this definition of empowerment is also the idea of the opportunity structure, or as the World Bank calls it, resources. And those are the institutional, social, and political contexts, the formal and informal rules and norms within which all individuals live and in which they can exert their agency. So as we go forward, while the GEAS definition of empowerment, true empowerment, does, sorry, Leah, for that confusion, as the GEAS definition of empowerment does include opportunity structures, what we really measured in GEAS and what the majority of the rest of the slides will show is agency. At an individual level, it is much more difficult to be able to evaluate all of the different kinds of opportunity structures and how they may interact with agency. And so while empowerment is really the intersection of these two concepts, what we really measured and wanted to identify the concepts and measurement of was agency. So next slide, please. So this is the conceptual model that we used, and I hope that you all can see it all right. But within agency, the Global Early Adolescent Study identified 3 domains that they felt were out of all the domains that the World Bank definition lists, and there are many. There were 3 that the Global Early Adolescent Study identified as really relevant for this age group. And so that is voice, the ability to express opinions and be heard, or the ability to express needs and desires. Freedom of movement, which we specified in this case for adolescents as the ability to meet with friends or the ability to participate in recreational activities, but the ability to move around in their neighborhoods and their environments without strict oversight. And then finally, decision-making, or the ability to make decisions that govern daily life, the ability to question the status quo, the ability to sort of make decisions and act on behaviors that were consistent with their own values. And we then think that agency, this is really where interventions can focus with more intention than on trying to necessarily change all of the opportunity structures that exist. And so we felt as though agency is really where interventions can occur, and then changes in agency would really be expressed through or work through the opportunity structures that exist to increase self-actualization or the ability of adolescents to achieve their desired outcomes. And we really, and these desired outcomes may not necessarily be reflective of outcomes they will achieve as 10 to 14-year-olds. They may be outcomes that are quite later in life, but that the groundwork for that empowerment really starts in this age group. And so their achievements of desired outcomes could be to complete school, it could be to find specific employment, it could just be the expression of healthy behaviors, such as negotiating condom use or delaying first sex. So the way in which agency works through all these different opportunity structures will influence different domains in the end. Next slide. So our specific research questions were, does a global measurement of empowerment, and again, I mean global as in a general measure of empowerment, emerge across multiple contexts? Do the subscales of voice, freedom of movement, and decision-making retain relevance when they're examined within each country? And are there specific items that are culturally specific? So the next slide. And the next slide. So using the methodology we used data from phase 1 of the Global Early Adolescence Study, and it was implemented in 14 cities between November 2015 and September 2016. And in each site was administered or attempted to be administered to 120 adolescents, both boys and girls who were aged 10 to 14 in each site. And in Kenya, there was an oversample of 500. Adolescents were recruited from their schools and community centers in urban poor communities. Again, just a reminder that this is not a randomized sample of all youth within a country, but it is really a focus on the urban poor. And interviews were conducted either face-to-face or self-administered on mobile tablets via computer-assisted self-interview or audio CASI. Next. So as I said before, the voice, freedom of movement, and decision-making were identified by the GEAS team and the collaborators through an exhaustive search of the literature and a lot of back and forth about the specific domains that they hypothesized to be relevant in this age group and across cultures. After those 3 domains were identified, for freedom of movement, it was a little less clear, and it varied quite a bit more by country in terms of the strength of the scale. And in Egypt and Malawi particularly, this item did not seem to scale very well. So I did look at the country specific, and I'm sorry, this doesn't have the right labels at the top to include the size and the factor loadings, but I did go back and include the freedom of movement to church or a religious center in each of the countries just to see if it did improve fit. And in Egypt particularly, inclusion of that item did improve that scale significantly and was very important, as you can see by the 0.72 factor loading. So in Egypt particularly, it just underscores that each of the items and each of these concepts are really context specific. And when developing these scales, while these are generally somewhat universal constructs, it's important to make sure that the items that are included are really relevant and adapted to the context in which the survey is being done. Finally, for behavioral control and decision making, again, the alphas are fairly high, but with a little bit more variation. And particularly in the DRC and Malawi, and somewhat in Vietnam, these questions don't really, or these scales don't load particularly well. In Vietnam, with the removal of the question regarding education, the scale is much higher. And again, this underscores the idea of the importance of adapting each scale to the culture. However, in DRC and Malawi, there's not much evidence of any specific item that could be dropped. It's just overall that this scale doesn't seem to be relevant in these two contexts. So finally, we looked at the mean scores, and the scores were created using the confirmatory factor analysis. So each item was weighted based on the importance of that item in the scale. And the scales went from a little bit above 1 to above 3 in each site. But overall, what you can see is that I looked at the statistical differences between each of these, and you can see that there is a statistically significant difference in the scores between voice, freedom of movement, and behavioral control between boys and girls. So when using the full sample, young girls, 10 to 14, have lower scores in every domain relative to boys. And the same is true for age, that 11 to 12 and 13 to 14-year-olds have much higher scores than 10-year-olds. The exception to that is freedom of movement, where it looks like 13 to 14-year-olds are really have a higher freedom of movement relative to either of the other age groups. And then finally, we looked at mean scores by sex and country, and I have 3 minutes left, so I'll go quite quickly. Here you can see that when including the scales only at the country level, there's not as much difference, and part of that is just the sample sizes are relatively small. But what is clear, there's two, is that in China, there's actually higher freedom of movement for girls and somewhat higher behavioral control, as they reported. And these are the only two cases where the scores of the girls were actually significantly higher than the boys. And in Egypt and India particularly, and Nigeria, not as strong, but also present, there were very significant differences in every subscale between voice, freedom of movement, and behavioral control between boys and girls. And very, very large differences, particularly for voice in Egypt and freedom of movement across all of the countries that were where it was significant. So confirmatory factor analysis does show that there are 3 and only 3 factors that correspond to the 3 domains we hypothesized. Voice has the highest alpha consistently in all of the countries, and the items tended to load well. When the information was combined together into one scale of empowerment using all observations, travel to religious center is not important, but it does contribute substantially within Egypt. And in some countries, the mean scores of subscales are significantly different for boys and girls, and it's particularly true for Egypt and India. So in conclusion, there is evidence that overall the 3 dimensions of voice, freedom of movement, and behavioral control are dimensions within a larger construct, which we think of as agency. Voice appears to be the most universal construct relative to freedom of movement or behavioral control. It was highly relevant in all countries, although each item differed somewhat. But behavioral control and decision-making, it seems, need further exploration, particularly in DRC and Malawi, to understand how to make these measures more contextually relevant. And it may be that the items need to be tweaked, it may be that different items need to be included, but that the items that were included did not seem to be very predictive of this concept of decision-making for adolescents in those countries. And again, that there are specific items that really demonstrate that context matters a great deal, and scales need to be adapted to reflect this. So questions about education and questions about religious movement around religious centers really depend on the context in which we're asking these questions. And there are likely other questions that can be included or changed to add into specific areas and countries. There are significant differences in agency that are reported by age 10 between boys and girls in several countries. And questions directly evaluate, it's just important to think through and remember that these questions really did directly evaluate agency. They did not evaluate the external structural factors, and so they're not a complete measure of empowerment. Multiple other dimensions of empowerment exist, and particularly for interventions that are focused on specific behaviors, such as smoking cessation, or I suppose for adolescents, smoking, not getting people to start smoking in the first place, condom use, etc., that for specific interventions, these might not be the best items to include, that you would want to include items that are more specific to the intervention that you are trying to implement. And identifying specific domains to incorporate along with more generic measures is necessary for interventions. So if you are trying to estimate empowerment to delay first sex, you would need to incorporate additional questions about specific domains relevant to that theory of empowerment. There are some limitations. It was limited sample sizes within each country, and it was limited to the urban poor. And for our high income countries, we generally did not have a large enough sample size to look at any differences across those countries. Our next steps are to assess whether economic empowerment is relevant. Originally, the thought was that economic empowerment was not relevant to this age group, but we do have some preliminary evidence that, at least in some countries, adolescents do have access to small amounts of money. And we are trying to see if there are differences based on that access and how they use that money and have control over it. But we didn't have those questions available for this phase 1 analysis. We want to assess whether there are health outcomes that are associated with agency and empowerment. As I said, the health instrument is quite long, and so we do want to see if there is any correlation between some of these outcomes and between agency and some of these other health outcomes. And finally, we can look and assess whether or not there are any other questions or modules in the early adolescent health instrument that can also be incorporated into these analyses and used to develop content-specific measures of empowerment. And particularly for the Global Early Adolescent Study, questions about sexual and reproductive health are highly relevant. All right, so I'm a few minutes over, but not too bad. And we can now take time for questions. And hopefully Leah can moderate this.
Hi, everyone. So I will be taking questions. In case I lose connectivity again, Bob is also on the line as a co-host backup. There are two ways to pose a question. One would be to go to the chat box that's at the bottom of your Zoom platform and type in your question, and I will read it out loud. Otherwise, you can raise your hand by going to the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom platform, raise your hand, and we will call on you. So we look forward to your questions, and please let me know if you need any other support in that. And just to add as well, if you could introduce who you are and what organization you're affiliated with your question as well, that would be great.
As people are raising and thinking about questions, and I see Deborah Barron does have one, but let me raise a question, Linnea, as you think about issues of empowerment. There's a huge interest here globally in empowering, particularly empowering girls and women. Empowerment is a central feature of the SDG 5, which has as its outcome empowering women and girls by 2020, which I think it may be used interchangeably with increasing gender equality. How do you think about, given the complexities that you've laid out, about interventions as it relates to achieving empowerment? Is it even feasible to think about empowerment of girls and women broadly, or is it all domain or context specific? Let me stop, turn it to you, and then back to you, Leah, because there are a number of questions raised.
Wow, that's a tough question, Bob. Really threw a tough one at me for before 8 a.m. So I do think one thing to think about in the question you laid out is whether interventions can improve empowerment more broadly or agency as we defined it. And I do think I would say my thoughts currently are really that interventions, one, are more specific, need to be more specific to agency, with unless they can be incredibly broad reaching, that the resources and opportunity structures are slow to change, are more difficult to change generally. And there are interventions to change those things for sure, but that the public health interventions, I think that most of us here on this webinar are probably thinking more about agency. I think, I mean, my thought really is that, as I said, this is all tied together. And so improving agency in specific domains is likely in many ways to improve agency in other ways, that allowing focusing on voice or self-esteem, or allowing girls to improve their ability to raise questions and dialogue, generally will most likely improve their ability to raise questions and dialogue in specific domains. So I don't know that I really have an answer for you. I think that both are necessary. I think that both are related. And I do think that improvements in agency are possible, but it's incredibly important always to think about whether the resources and opportunity structures available allow for that change in agency. Empowering people and giving them agency and saying, you deserve this, you should raise your voice and say what you want in a place or a country where it's really not appropriate to do that, is something to think about and be potentially concerned about. So I don't know that I answered your question, but those are my thoughts.
Thanks so much, Linnea. So I'm going to start reading from the list of great questions we have coming in on the chat box. The first of which is from Deborah Barron, who is with WITS RHI in Johannesburg. She says, I know that the GEAS also interviewed parents of young people. Did you do any analysis of how their norms or perspectives of their children's empowerment aligned with their children's perspectives or influenced it?
For this study, we did not. And Bob or Caroline can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. For this study, we did not ask the specific questions that would sort of parallel the questions we asked the adolescents. But in the phase 2 of the study, when certain sites are moving towards longitudinal panels, there was discussion of adding questions that paralleled this for adolescent or for parents, and trying to combine these to see if there are relationships there. But Bob or Caroline or even Leah would have to confirm if we did end up adding those questions. As always, there's a lot of demand to add questions and a limit to what you can add.
So in the first phase of the work, the questions that we asked parents were part of the qualitative, the formative research that we did. So we did in each country, parent young adolescent dyads of about 35 young people. And we were looking at transitions into adolescence, the issues that they faced, and the differences between generations. So we did not tap the same kinds of quantitative questions that we asked of adolescents later as we moved into the quantitative stage of the work that we did. So the comparison, which would be very interesting, at this point, we don't have the capacity to analyze. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Bob and Linnea. So the next question is from GEAS at Child Fund. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, who wanted to know whether we are only using survey methodology and whether the data is only quantitative.
Bob just alluded to this. So there was qualitative work that was completed, but the qualitative work focused more on the gender norms component more so than the empowerment component. I think it's possible to potentially reanalyze some of those to see if there was some discussion of empowerment and how that played out, but it wasn't included in this analysis.
Ursula from The Girl Effect would like to know whether you found similar patterns for boys and girls in different age groups. So is the difference by age group similar among both genders?
In truth, Ursula, I have not looked yet, and I will do that. That is a very, very good question. So I will double check and look at that.
Next, Temiteo, who is a doctoral nursing student with the University of Edinburgh, wanted to know whether or how we negotiated the issue of informed consent in the adolescent age group, especially in countries where the consent age is 16 or 18 years old.
Can I throw that to you, Bob? I know that parental consent was sought first.
Sure. So to take a step back, this study was reviewed and approved by 3 IRBs. One is the Ethical Review Board of the World Health Organization. The second is the in-country Ethical Review Board in each of the partner countries. And the third was Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We obtained written consent from parents to participate and written assent for young people to participate. So, and as we are now in the longitudinal phase of our work, it is the same. We get written consent from parents and written assent from adolescents who are 10 to 14. And while originally there was a sense that it's going to be impossible to ask adolescents of this age questions, and parents would absolutely refuse, particularly because we ask quite a number of sensitive questions. The empowerment questions are far, far from the most sensitive questions, that we would not be able to get IRB approval, and if we did, we would not get parental consent. But we have not found that to be true at all. In fact, we have very few refusals, and we have had no country that has refused participation. In a couple of places, we've had to make some modifications of questions, particularly around sexual reproductive health questions and at what age to ask certain questions. But that's a different topic. That's how we obtain consent. Back to you, Leah.
Great, thanks, Bob and Linnea. So we also have a note from one of our colleagues at the POP Council Nairobi regarding our collaboration on the work between the POP Council and the GEAS there. And there's one more question from GEAS that I'm actually not quite sure that I understand. Question is, what kind of friendly methodology is used by the researcher? Child youth-led methodology helps to make the research more participatory. Tigist, I might ask that you reframe your question, and I can read it out loud again if you don't mind. I'm not quite sure if I am understanding your question. Thank you so much. So another question from Ursula. What are your plans for looking at associations between agency and health outcomes? Will this look at if or why agency is important for adolescents' health?
Yes, it will. So the first thing to look at just broadly is to look to see if there are, we need to identify specific health outcomes that for 10 to 14-year-olds that occur frequently enough to even assess. So we did ask questions in the health instrument about sexual and reproductive health behaviors, but really very few adolescents in this age group had any exposure to or knowledge of sexual and reproductive health. So the first thing we need to do is actually really identify health outcomes that occur frequently enough for us to assess if there's a correlation between them and agency that makes sense causally. So that is the very first step. And using the phase 1 data, the best we can do is look at correlation. It's cross-sectional, so we can't do much more than just see if things are correlated. We're not sure if which influences which, really. But in the next phase, which is longitudinal, there are specific outcomes, and as it's longitudinal, the adolescents will age into older age groups and have more exposure to sexual and reproductive health. And then it will be possible to look to see if differences in agency, changes in agency over time, if those are related to some specific sexual and reproductive health outcomes. And there are other questions in the health outcome, in the health instrument related to experience of adverse events. And those may also be things to look at in terms of, again, looking at correlation as opposed to causation, but to see if experience of adverse events is related in any way to some of these scales and overall agency.
Great, thanks, Linnea. So we're just coming up on the hour. If there is one more quick question, I think we could take it. Otherwise, I think we will be coming up on the end of our time. So thank you everyone so much for your participation in this webinar, and Linnea for presenting. We will be making the recording of the webinar available on our website, so long as it was not interrupted by our technical issues, and the slides as well. So please stay tuned on our website, listserv, and social media for that information, as well as information about future GEAS webinars and events. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.